can't believe quite how near Christmas is.
It's terrifying, isn't it?
I know. I looked up in my diary and I thought, I've got another week to get organised. And then I realised I hadn't, that there was actually a week missing in my head. And that in 2 weeks' time it will be the 23rd of December and really everything will be beginning to stop and I won't have started.
I've been very lucky in that my partner is incredibly organised when it comes to Christmas gifts. And because we're moving house this year, we need to get on it really early. But also this podcast is a chance for me to tell people I'm moving house in case they have my address. And now they'll know that they might need a new one. Sorry, I'm using the podcast for ulterior means here.
Yeah, so this podcast is also a perfect opportunity for me to tell my friends that I haven't done any Christmas shopping and that they're highly unlikely to have a present as a result. I have this friend who is like Carrie, super organised and does everything long time in advance and buys, in January her Christmas decorations for the following year. And she sent me this really, truly smug message saying, I have done my Christmas shopping. And she sent it 2 weeks ago. So I said, it will not surprise you to know that I haven't started my Christmas shopping.
I'm going to defend critics and theatre enthusiasts because normally you do your Christmas shopping after work. But actually after work is when a lot of us have to go out and see shows. So we actually lose probably about 50% of our Christmas shopping time to our noble profession.
And it is also true, as we've mentioned in previous podcasts, that it's a really busy time of year and it's got more busy for critics than it used to be because it's not just all the pantos and the seasonal shows that are opening, but quite a lot of heavyweight theatre. I now go into a run really where I'm out at things every night and everything seems to last 3 hours. And that's, it's lovely and I'm not complaining a tiny bit, but it is tricky because it does take away time that you might actually be getting ready for a festive season.
It's also when we're compiling our end-of-year lists of our favourite shows of the year, we almost have to, like a game of chicken, leave it as late as you can because there might be that show that opens just before the end of the year and it kind of upend your entire list of your favourite shows. Yeah. And you won't be able to know that until just before it opens.
It's like the theatre producers just playing with the psychology of theatre critics. So you can't complete your list of the year until the 24th of December. Because we have a huge opening of The Tempest on the 19th of December. And so that really, you can't, it may be brilliant and it may not be brilliant, but you've got to have it as a possibility if you're doing what was good in 2024. So that's why we're not talking about the end of the year.
Just yet. This is an extended trail for that. But we are actually lending a helping hand to those people who like to leave their Christmas shopping to the last minute.
Exactly. So obviously I plan this podcast and let me say welcome to this edition of the What's on Stage podcast with me, Sarah Crompton.
And me, Alex Wood.
And between us, we've been doing last minute theatrical stocking fillers.
Yes, and yours are taking book form. And mine are taking vinyl form.
So do you want to start? Because you're all singing, all dancing, and I'm rather studious.
A word on vinyl, I think, before I start, is in the last few years or last decade or so, there has been this vinyl renaissance that's been very well documented. People have moved away from streaming as their main expenditure point when it comes to music and going back to the tangible, going back to something that they can hold and display and use as a fashion accessory in their homes to show all the cool snazzy music they've got. I think my greatest vinyl is one of the original West Side Story vinyls from when the film first came out that my parents left in the attic, and I found it and said, right, I'm keeping this for the rest of my life.
That is impressive. I've got The Sound of Music on the same basis. Yeah.
So it seems as though a lot of shows are now putting out their own vinyl. So you've got Operation Mincemeat is putting out one for Christmas.
Oh, wow.
And then my first discussion point was going to be Hadestown, which we have mentioned a fair few times on this podcast, but they've released a live from London recording featuring the original London cast with Donal Finn, Grace Hodgett-Young, Gloria Onitiri, Zachary James, and Melanie LaBarrie, sort of the 5 leads. And it's really wonderful because you can contrast it with the original Broadway cast recording, which had the original Broadway American accented cast versus this cast of UK and American performers, each with bringing their own accents. So Grace Hodgett-Young, for example, has got a Derbyshire accent, I think she's from, and Donal Finn is from somewhere in Ireland.
He's Irish, definitely.
Yes. It's really, really wonderful to be able to contrast the two and see how Anais Mitchell's music, lyrics and book are completely transformed when you do these shows in different accents compared to the stock Broadway American accent that seems to exist for the vast majority of the original Broadway cast. One thing that has catapulted it to the top of my list is that because they recorded it live at the Lyric Theatre, you can hear the rough edges, and they have been unapologetic in keeping those in place. So if, for example, Donal Finn's voice cracks during his falsetto, and there is a lot of falsetto that he has to do in Hadestown, that's still preserved on the recording, and the hoarseness and the energy and the characterization that he brings to those lyrics is right there. The other thing that was really wonderful is that because they recorded the vinyl towards the end of the run, they've had multiple weeks for the cast to find their own feet within this production, find the different interpretations of the lyrics that when you're recording a cast album way back during previews or even just after opening can feel a lot more artificial. So the Live from London version feels a lot more lived in. Right. And it feels a lot more like you're actually sat in the Lyric Theatre hearing this original London cast.
It is interesting that they've done it because I interviewed them just before they started the London run. And they were really excited about that idea of having different accents and allowing the show to develop in a different way than it had done on Broadway. Because, of course, it's got quite a long gestation period because it had that National Theatre run, which was effectively almost like a previews run where they knocked it in shape. Then it went to Broadway, it had, great success. And then after quite a long time, has come back to London, but quite substantially rethought, at least in terms of the telling, I think. And the accents were so much a part of that. And I really, really loved that in them, that you felt so strongly that people weren't stranded mid-Atlantic, which is what can happen, and that they were being allowed to speak with their own voice. And it had a richness and a resonance, I thought, that I would, really, if you put that in my stocking, apart from the strangeness of the shape that it would turn my stocking into, then I would be very excited, because I do think it was a sensational singing of that show. And it is a brilliant show in terms of the songs. It's just terrific. I always like live recordings. One of my most treasured albums generally is the Sondheim concert of Company, which isn't perfect and also has that sense of rough edges, but it was both a film and a recording, and it was one of my earliest introductions to Sondheim, and I still go back to it with such pleasure because it's just like dreamcasting, but also it has got that slight lack of perfection which somehow makes you feel you're there.
Albums are beautiful things because they make the transient medium of theatre into something more permanent. And if you can honour that transience in the way you do that, I think it's a lot more rich and fun. One final thing on Hadestown from me is that also you're bringing the show full circle, because it started out as an album. And in fact, the original Orpheus was Justin Vernon from Bon Iver, which is really interesting. You can listen to the original album on Spotify with him as Orpheus.
I didn't know that, or at least I've forgotten that.
He's really the progenitor for a lot of that show. And you can almost see what they cut, what they added, what they changed, and the whole album itself feels very malleable because it's Anais Mitchell has taken what she originally put on the album and turned it into something that's very live, and you feel very much in the room, and she's completely reorchestrated it from that original concept album. So that's really interesting for the Hadestown completists. You mentioned Sondheim. Is that going to be your first point of discussion?
It was. I was going for a little segue into one of my choices for Christmas book. So I am going to recommend How Sondheim Can Change Your Life by Richard Schoch, which is a must, I think, for Sondheim fans, and is a really interesting book at many levels. I mean, I do love books about Sondheim. Sondheim did change my life. There is absolutely no doubt about that I feel that the discovery of him has forged friendships, has changed my view of things, certainly changed my view of musical theatre, which at that point I was feeling quite disillusioned with, and has led me in all kinds of different directions. So I'm very in sympathy with the idea of the book. And it's a really, really interesting concept because it's a bit biography of Sondheim and full of good anecdotes about how songs came into being. So like the famous story about Send in the Clowns, where they were going to write a song in the scene for the male character, Frederick, and then how Prince recognised that they needed a song for the female character. And Sondheim almost literally produces Send in the Clowns overnight, you know, wow. Because he recognises that he needs a song where Desiree, who is the actress who's made bad choices, talks about making bad choices. And he wrote it both on the spot, more or less. I mean, obviously that's slight exaggeration, and Richard goes into how it happened, but also to suit the range of Glynis Johns, who had quite a limited singing range, wow. Which is one reason that it's been so popular with so many singers ever since, because you can sing it as a great singer. But actually, if you've got quite a small range, but you're very expressive and very dramatic, then you can sing it as well. So there's a lot of that. There's a lot of sort of background stories. So Richard's essential argument, and I call him Richard because I met him this year, is that Sondheim's works understand us as much as we understand them, and that they give us a means of understanding life, like all great art. And there's a moment that he quotes in Sunday in the Park with George where Dot, who is Sarah's model, talks about an artist giving us more to say. So the argument of the book, essentially, is that great art, which is what Sondheim is, it is that it gives you a greater understanding and gives you an ability to make sense of the world. He, as a professor of drama and a Sondheim fan, he analyses the works in terms of how they relate to us, how they make an audience change their view, or they reflect a general emotion, like everybody wanting to be kissed by a prince in Into the Woods, and what effect being kissed by a prince has on you, and what effect a moment in the woods can have. And it's all the time pulling it back to life and to psychology and to the effect on your view of the world that Sondheim has. And I think it's a really interesting thing to do.
Is there another moment in the book that really struck you reading it?
Well, he talks. I think the whole book is really interesting. He talks a lot about Sweeney Todd, which is I've always loved. He treats Sondheim like he's Shakespeare. And he does very detailed textual and musical analysis of how songs work. So in the Sweeney Todd bit, he talks about the shift in Sweeney Todd's desire for revenge on a specific person to his desire for revenge on the whole world.
Yeah.
And he further goes on, which had never struck me and I thought was so interesting, that the song Epiphany, which is where essentially you see Todd go mad in front of your eyes, and this very specific and just right desire for vengeance becomes they all deserve to die, that everybody in the world's going to be killed. And he sings it, and that song ends on a tragic note. Anyone who knows the musical will know that it comes in, it's got two really clashing chords at the end of it. So the audience can't applaud. So you can't think, wow, that's an amazing song. You literally are stopped from applauding. But then in the scene, they go on to sing A Little Priest, which is a comic song between Sweeney Todd and Mrs. Lovett. And that Mrs. Lovett, you know, essentially is saying exactly the same thing as Sweeney Todd. She's saying they all deserve to die. And she gives you a reason why everybody deserves to die. But she makes it funny. And because of that, Sondheim gets the best of both worlds, because he can withhold applause from Sweeney, but you applaud exactly the same thing at the end of Mrs. Lovett singing A Little Priest, because that's the release. And I think that's such good textual analysis, really. And I really love the depth that this book brings to Sondheim.
It's funny how Sweeney Todd has always felt to me like popcorn Sondheim to some extent. It's the crowd pleaser one, but actually, like you say, there is so much underneath the bonnet there in terms of the musical analysis that goes on. There's a fantastic video about how the Deus Irae is used throughout time and again to layer the music in a really interesting way and make death the central motif that comes up and up again every time.
Yes, and though we shouldn't get too much sort of bogged down in discussion of Sweeney Todd, the interesting thing about Sweeney Todd of all Sondheim shows is that it shifted its reputation. So that when it opened at Drury Lane, as I've often remembered, because that was one of the earliest shows I saw with Dennis Quilly and Sheila Hancock. It was a flop. So it was so far from being popcorn Sondheim, because people just didn't get why anybody would want to spend so long in the theatre watching this incredibly dark tale of retribution. And then gradually down the years, it's become the show that everybody loves, and it's been adapted in so many different ways. And one of the things that Richard Schoch does is take it back to its origins, I think, and look at the Hal Princet and the way that essentially it's a critique of capitalism. You know, everybody's stuck in the factory, everybody's stuck in this world of corruption, which does sometimes get lost in more friendly stagings of it. So it's a nice book. And if you know someone who likes musical theatre and particularly likes Sondheim, I would definitely recommend that you stuffed it in their stocking. What else have you got up your sleeve?
I'm going to keep on the subject of musicals. I know we've got some non-musical subject matter coming up later as well. The second album I've gone for on my vinyl list is Lin-Manuel Miranda and Eisa Davis's Warriors, which we have discussed on this podcast before in a small amount of detail, but not a huge amount of detail. For me, the most radical thing initially was the fact that Lin-Manuel Miranda was creating a new musical not for the stage and not for film, in the way he had done with something like Encanto or Moana, where he'd written the music for a Disney film. Here, it's entirely in the medium of sound. And you have to create the world for yourself in your imagination or using some of the visual prompts that the album provides. There's no stage for you to imagine in the way there would have been for Hamilton or for In the Heights. Everything is done through your imagination. All the characters you have to think of in your own way, which is really lovely. I think we forget that there were multiple years in the UK where we didn't have Hamilton and we didn't have In the Heights. We just had the albums, and that was our way into Lin-Manuel Miranda's work. So in a way, that process is being repeated with Warriors. I just don't think that Warriors will ever get to the stage at this point. I really think that it's too ambitious, and you would need this huge budget or even a non-Broadway venue in order to make it work. I'm more than happy to be proved wrong about that fact, but it is such a brilliant masterpiece. And the thing that vinyl and recordings on Spotify or wherever enable you to do is you can go back and keep listening. So one thing that I have done whilst out walking the dog at night is listen to the same numbers over again and think, okay, what's going underneath that? What are they sampling? Oh, that's foreshadowing this section in Act 2. Oh, there's a moment in the first number that preempts someone's death right at the end of Act 2 that you'll only notice at the end of the show, and you won't probably even notice it if you're watching it on stage for the first time. That for me is really, really brilliant. An artist is saying, look at everything that I've done. I'm not going to throw it at you for a few hours. I'm going to let you sit with it and let it marinate with you. And a live recording enables you to do that. So for those who don't know, it's based on the film The Warriors, about a group of delinquents, I suppose is one word. Yeah. A gang from Coney Island that have to go to the Bronx for a big meeting amongst all the different gangs. But then there is an assassination during this meeting.
Right.
And our gang, the Warriors, are blamed for the assassination. And then they have to essentially try and get home through New York whilst fending off all the other gangs and the police, knowing that they are innocent, but not knowing why they are being blamed for this assassination.
Yeah.
And what Lin-Manuel Miranda and Eisa Davis do with the album is they gender flip the Warriors. So they're all women having to deal with not only trying to survive the night, but also surviving a very misogynistic night. And there's so many conversations around women's safety in New York or elsewhere in cities and metropolitan areas, that it taps into that quite consistently throughout. But also it allows you to bring in all these different gangs with their different personalities and musical styles. So you're not just travelling through a dangerous New York, you're also travelling through a New York with so many different communities from the musical styles that they're all providing. So that's, yeah, definitely one. So you can go straight from like a K-pop number to calypso to hip-hop to rap to heavy metal. Anywhere else that wouldn't work. But actually when you've got an album that acts like a compilation album, it really does.
It allows you to do it. What's interesting to me about that as well is that I do think Lin-Manuel Miranda is in many ways the heir to Sondheim. They're not the same at all. Their compositional technique is not the same. But what he resolutely refuses to do is repeat himself. And, you know, Moana 2 has come out. He's not involved in that. He's pulled himself out of that Disney franchise, which, you know, he could have gone on and on doing very successfully. It's a huge franchise. But he wanted to do something that is different. And I think that that is why he's such an exciting talent, that you never know what he'll do next. And he's all the time challenging himself, challenging the ways in which he can develop musical theatre form, which he's so interested in. And yeah, I really love him. And I think it's exciting that he's pushing the envelope in that way. It is like a real challenge to a producer to say, come on, put it on. I mean, you could imagine it in a warehouse or something, can't you? You can imagine it done as a kind of poor theatre, bare bones production. But then that's really hard to do because, as we know, musicals struggle to make their money back. So even a poor theatre version would be tricky.
Maybe it needs to be made into a film straight away.
That might be happening. That might be happening behind the scenes, and we don't know.
I'd also say that Eisa Davis is a brilliant playwright in her own right, through plays like Bull Rusher or Angela's Mixtape. Yeah. And I love the fact that they found each other and created something together, because you can pinpoint some of the Lin-Manuel Miranda-isms, but there's some other things that feel very unfamiliar to those who might know In the Heights or Hamilton. And that's really lovely, as you say, to see an artist push themselves and use other artists and use that, co-creative energy to really find something new. Yeah,
that's the other thing about great art. I mean, that comes up over and over again in the Sondheim book, how reliant he was on collaborators, and I think, great artists always want to work with great collaborators and people who challenge them, not who just simply say, let's go down the same path over and over again. On which subject I could slightly segue into my second book choice, which is Al Pacino's Sonny Boy, which is a deeply eccentric autobiography. I chose, instead of reading it, to listen to it on audiobook, which I really recommend as an experience, because it's like having Pacino growling in your ear. Right at the start, he expresses his own ambivalence about writing an autobiography at all. And that tension is there in the book. So he says, this is part of my life. It's not all of my life. And I've chosen to withhold some things. Why it's so fascinating is that it's full of brilliant stories about the movies. So obviously, he was the movie star of the 70s and 80s. Hang on. Yeah, 70s. Yeah, 70s and 80s. With Godfather 1 and 2, Dog Day Afternoon, which is my personal favourite, Scarface, and so on. And so the stories about those are brilliant, gluing his hand to a machine gun in Scarface, and Coppola saying, I don't know why I've cast you when he can't do anything in Godfather. And, he's asked to drive a car and he can't do that, and he's asked to dance and he can't do that. And, there is all that stuff. It's fascinating, and it's told very well, and it's quite racy. He omits his personal life a lot in weird ways, so that the birth of his children and so on is passed over quite fast. But where it's really, really rich is in his love for the stage. And he talks so well about the process of being an actor, and the idea that he was made into an actor by the fact that in his very hard scrabble childhood, his mum took him to the movies. And he says he learns to engage his imagination early. But then that fascination really took him to off-Broadway productions, and the early stuff about him learning his craft, of actually finding ways to be an actor, is fascinating.
As a somewhat naive film fan, you do forget that even though he is known for those sort of like Godfathers or Scarfaces, Shakespeare really is, like you say, his first love in some ways. And looking at his track record with Richard III or Shylock, there is so much that he brings to those characters, but also I think there's so much those characters allow him to do. It's almost like they're a release for him away from the big glitzy lights into something that's more rewarding and not going to get him to forced to be driving a car.
and are the key to him. So he has a brilliant quote about doing a Strindberg play and realising that the words coming out are Strindberg's words, but he's saying them as though they are his. And that sounds a really obvious thing to say of an actor, but that complete identification of part and performer is in fact the key that makes really good acting, when you feel that somebody has become the character, you know that they're separate, but they are speaking words as if they are theirs. It is the moment that the performance takes off. And Pacino can do it. He can also not do it. I mean, he is, to me, a deeply frustrating actor. The only time I actually ever saw him live was in Glengarry Glen Ross, where he, in the course of an evening, did both sides of his performance. I think he was slightly miscast anyway. The audience had gone to see him.
Yes.
That was, everybody had paid the money. And in the first half, he was truly dreadful. And you felt all you were seeing was Pacino. You weren't seeing a character at all. And then in the second half, whatever he told himself in the interval, he suddenly got it and brought the character so beautifully to life. So he is a fascinating figure. And the book is a fascinating read. And an even more so listen with that growl in your ear.
For a digital stocking, then that one.
Yes, exactly, which most of my friends might be getting. So I'm just
on a broader point, I do think that there is something to be said about when obituaries come out for performers like, for example, Maggie Smith. As a tendency, a lot of the obit writers will always go for the TV and film credits. Maggie Smith, for example, it was Harry Potter star Maggie Smith or something. And you almost wince that there's that huge back catalogue of theatrical performance that almost gets relegated to a footnote because it would only have had a minor impact on the larger cultural zeitgeist. Millions of people, billions perhaps, of people will have seen Maggie Smith as McGonagall, but very few will have seen her in A German Life at the Bridge Theatre, even though I was far more arrested by the latter than the former. And maybe I'm just expressing a bit of melancholy at that being the reality we face.
It is the thing about theatre. One of the many books I've been reading about theatre is Judi Dench's book, which we'll come on to talk about a bit more. But she says one of the things that she loves about theatre is that things go wrong, and that because of that it really is that unique experience of just being there on the night, because some nights things will go wrong and some nights things will go right, but you have to be there to experience either of them. And I think that's always the problem with live performance. It's certainly the same with dance. I guess it's the same with some music where people say, I was there when Bob Dylan, did X, because you have to experience it live. But one of the most interesting things is that sense of catching transience. And all of these books about theatre, to some extent, are attempting to do that, to pin down what it is that makes a performance, what it is that makes that moment so special.
Do you want to leapfrog me then, as it seems like you've set yourself up nicely for your next pick for top book to read or deliver to someone else?
To deliver to someone. Well, this is the book I want in my stocking, really, because I haven't read it. And so I feel that I can't review it in any sense. But it won the Society for Theatre Research Prize, which is a prize given annually to the best book about theatre. And I respect the judges, and I think this sounds interesting. It's called Out for Blood, A Cultural History of Carrie the Musical. And it's interesting because I am a fan of the Backstage Disaster book. And this is obviously a backstage disaster. Carrie the Musical, for those who don't know, was the RSC's attempt to have a hit musical that became a byword for a complete flop. And I think, without spoiling the book, you have to know that in advance to enjoy the sense of the fact that, everything that could go wrong did go wrong at almost every stage. And there is something utterly joyful about those books. And just as a tiny tangent, I am going to recommend a book I have read, which is a similar story of a total flop, but this is a flop you won't have heard of, which is called Stage Managing Chaos, a diary of the Old Vic production of Fernando Arrabal's The Architect and the Emperor of Assyria. And this was an early production at the Old Vic, and it's the funniest book about a highfalutin stage production going wrong that I've ever read. And you can get it self-published and you can get it online. And I really recommend that anybody who wants a laugh this Christmas has a read of that. And it had quite high-profile people involved in it, like Anthony Hopkins, but it remains one of the epic stage disasters of all time. So those two are my disaster picks.
With Carrie the Musical, which apparently might be coming back soon.
No.
Heard it here first. Almost its infamy.
I refuse to believe that.
Well, we can rendezvous this time next year and we can talk about it. I think the infamy, in a way, catapulted what was probably quite a mediocre musical into the legend status, so that it has so many fans and followers now. You know, there's a dedicated podcast about Carrie the Musical because it was such a train wreck. In a similar vein to if you delve into what happened behind the scenes on the original Wizard of Oz film, it's up there in terms of calamity, but it has made it now one of the most popular musicals for new fans because it had such a reputation.
That's so interesting. I didn't know that, you see, because I suppose that's also slightly generational, because I just wrote it off because I was around when it was a flop and I just never really went back to it. And that is interesting. And also, I guess it's a horror movie. The collision of a horror movie and a horrific car crash of a musical has a certain synergy, which I can absolutely relate to.
Circling back to the transient issue of capturing something live and allowing it to exist in perpetuity is my final pick, which is the album version of Sunset Boulevard, currently playing on Broadway and a regular presence on this podcast as well.
Yeah.
We talk about it extensively, but this time around I wanted to discuss Alan Williams, who was the musical supervisor. And one of the brilliant things about the album is that because it was recorded live at the Savoy Theatre and the audio was taken from the mixing desk and then was remixed for the album by Andrew Lloyd Webber. He did a really, really interesting interview with Billboard about it. He is a music nerd first and foremost. If he hadn't become composer extraordinaire, he probably would have been a curmudgeonly sound engineer somewhere because he knows everything there is to know about sound design. But brilliantly, what he has allowed Alan Williams to do in this album is go into his music and pull out so many different ideas that you allow the woodwind or the brass to almost become its own character. And you'll notice certain melodies that would exist early on almost act in conversation with the characters and they don't realise it. And it creates a huge sense of foreboding for Joe Gillis as he goes along that I really, really found wonderful, because you don't get any of the visual stimuli when you listen to this album, but it feels more like a radio play than it does feel like an album or a greatest hits package of Jamie Lloyd's production of Sunset Boulevard.
Wow.
And the fact that they've allowed themselves the space to record it at the Savoy Theatre rather than in a sound studio, which can feel very inauthentic. You feel the audience and you feel the space around Tom Francis. You feel the space around Nicole Scherzinger. The way that these performers interact with each other, there is that sense that you're in a room with them rather than they're in a sound booth isolated from their co-stars. And for me, that feels much more galvanising and much more true to the origins of this production than it does to, say, a standard cast album that you would get for a new musical that has been recorded across many weeks with performers coming in for a few hours to record their set sections and then it all being bundled together. It shows that this is really like an ode to performance, that so many of different components can come together, and what a saxophonist is doing under the stage is just as important as what Tom Francis is doing on the stage.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting that it seems to me that people are much more interested in catching those moments, both orally and in terms of how they write about theatre. I think that there's much less sense of definitive and more of a sense of allowing a greater number of people to share the live experience. That has been the notable quality of the books I've read most of this year, which is there are an extraordinary number of books about Shakespeare. I mean, I am knocked out by the fact that this playwright still goes on getting so many books published about him every year. But the richest of those have been actors' guides to playing Shakespeare. Harriet Walter has done a book called She Speaks, which is a really interesting, quirky stocking filler, where she has imagined what Shakespeare's female characters would say if they were allowed to speak. So she's very funny about Gertrude, for example, going, I really fancied him. And she's written responses in blank verse. It's a very unusual book and not quite to my taste, but I mean, I do admire it enormously. But the books I have loved this year on Shakespeare have been Simon Russell Beale's A Piece of Work, and most of all Judi Dench's The Man Who Pays the Rent, which I was determined not to like because I don't like the title. I mean, it's what she and Michael Williams used to call Shakespeare when they were working at Stratford. But there's something about that jokiness that I found a bit irritating. But in fact, the book is wonderful. It's a conversation. That's the first thing. It's recorded by Brendan O'Hay, a director who she's obviously friends with, and they talk freely and at length about each character that she has played, each female character. And he weaves very elegantly into that questions about the productions and about working with different directors. And it's full of insight about theatre. So one of the things I learned from it is that she adores working with Trevor Nunn, who makes her laugh all the time. And she tells stories about him that really surprise me because I've always thought Trevor Nunn seemed quite serious, but clearly not. She talks about Peter Hall teaching them to speak Shakespeare by beating time and actually standing for a long time behind the lectern, going through the verse and making sure that everybody put the emphasis in the right place, which I found riveting. And then she also has got stories like Michael Saint-Denis, who was the first person she worked with when she did Anya in Chekhov, and he made her repeat a single line through an afternoon over and over again. So there's lots and lots of brilliant stories. But what is so great about the book is when she simply analyses her own reaction to the characters, and she does it line by line, almost scene by scene. So in that famous Macbeth, which she did with Ian McKellen, where Nunn apparently made them rehearse in darkness to get the sense of fear after they've killed Duncan. She goes through the scene of the murder of Duncan and explains what she was thinking and how she was doing it. And she's 90. She is the best Shakespearean verse speaker in many ways of my lifetime. And it's just riveting to sit down and dip in and out of the book or read it all through. And I've found I've gone back to it over and over again.
One of the reasons that I think actors make for fantastic writers when it comes to Shakespeare is that for the vast majority of us, Shakespeare is an academic experience, in that you will sit in a classroom, read Richard II, pull out some of the simile and metaphor and discuss those, and then compare it to historical fact. And then you'll get an exam, and then you'll get a B+, and that'll be the end of it. With actors, Shakespeare isn't academic, it's a vocation. And they bring a whole other perspective to the experience. Yeah. And they tap into that live, raw, unexpected aspect of Shakespeare that is very rare for people actually studying it in school. So it makes it feel new and interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. And Simon Russell Beale actually tackles that directly. When he's introducing the book, he says, I'm not a scholar, I'm not a lecturer, I don't know these things, I'm not an academic, but I just know how I did them. And again, it's full of insight. He actually marks up his script before he starts any Shakespeare performance with dots and dashes where the emphasis and the breaks are, and finds that invaluable. And I found that interesting because Russell Beale, like Dench, always seems like completely natural speaker of Shakespeare. So the fact that so much rigour is involved in it is fascinating. And then one of the bits I really love was that he talks about Leontes and Hermione and the Winter's Tale. I love Winter's Tale. It's one of my absolute favourite plays. And one of the conversations I have had this year is with one of my nieces. We've been talking about the ending of that play and the fact that Hermione is silent. So Hermione comes back to life, and it seems as if hope and forgiveness are the themes of the play, but Hermione does not speak. And modern scholarship, I think, thinks that indicates she doesn't forgive Leontes. And Russell Beale writes about that and says you just can't play it that way. For him, the fact that a play where a man's anger and jealousy and mistakenness has caused death has to have some forgiveness. It has to reach a poetic resolution. And he explains why he feels you can't act it that way. And it's so interesting to read. And and it adds to that sense of debate all the time around Shakespeare, which I guess is why so many books about him keep appearing.
Bringing it back to something you were discussing about Sondheim, in that Sondheim allows performers to find something in themselves, or Sondheim writes for people as much as they help him to write. I think the same is true of Shakespeare to some extent, that, like you've just proven with Russell Beale, there is so much between the lines that you can throw yourself into or find within yourself, like a conclusion to A Winter's Tale, because I think some people would find Hermione's silence, enraging, and actually be able to find something very different with that compared to his need to find something cathartic. And it says as much about him than it does of the text.
Yeah, the wonderful thing about all of these books is that his personality comes over. And I think essentially, though he's played a lot of Shakespeare villains, he was a scary Iago, and he talks about that. He was terrifying Richard III. Actually, there is something in Russell Beale's nature that makes you feel that he was a particularly sweet prince when he played Hamlet. And I think there is something in him that makes you think that is his instinct, is to find the redemption in a character. And that's what makes him, one of the dominant Shakespeare players of our age. So there's a lot to be found in these books for Christmas. I really recommend them all.
Yeah, I feel as though hopefully our audience's friends' stockings will be well filled now after our series of recommendations.
Yeah, and it is a great thing for anybody who is as late with their shopping as I always am. You can get them digitally, or you can go to your local bookshop. I'm very in favour of local bookshops. Or you can order them online.
Yeah, so plenty of options for people who need to run out on 23rd of December to buy something in the last minute. And you can get it before you see a show. So if you're off to one of our venues to see A Christmas Carol or The Importance of Being Earnest or something, you can pick up a Christmas present beforehand.
Exactly.
Well, on that note, I think we should say goodbye to our lovely listeners. So it's a goodbye from me, Alex Wood.
And a goodbye from me, Sarah Crompton. We'll be back next week looking at our choices of the year.
Yes, top shows. After a flurry of last-minute openings.
Recording it very late in the day.
Yes, but we want to be comprehensive, so we're going to make sure that we get everything in, including The Tempest at Theatre Royal Drury Lane. So that will be a breaking news review. And
on a final note, please don't forget to subscribe, to like, to send us your queries and questions wherever you listen to your podcasts. And we'll look forward to joining you next week.